Laura Martin had always thought she had finally found a safe corner of the world after the chaos that had filled the years following her husband's death. She had moved to this suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of Columbus with her teenage son Thomas less than 2 years ago, buying a house that she could both afford and love. A 2-story colonial style with pale blue siding, a large porch, and a backyard big enough for Thomas to shoot hoops with his friends. As an architect who worked from home, Laura valued privacy and the ability to focus without distractions, and the community initially seemed like a place where she could heal from grief and raise her son without constant worry. From the moment she unpacked the last box and began to arrange furniture, she felt certain that she had made the right choice. The streets were quiet, lined with mature maples and clean sidewalks, and nearly every front yard was immaculate, trimmed to perfection and decorated with the kind of seasonal touches that suggested a neighborhood where residents cared about. Appearances in order. There were occasional flyers in her mailbox about meetings and community announcements from the local board, but she rarely paid close attention. She believed that these types of committees were simply concerned with the usual small-town issues: property values, yard maintenance, and neighborhood events. Laura had never been one to involve herself in neighborhood politics. She knew some of the faces and could recall a few names when she passed people walking their dogs, but she kept her distance and remained polite without getting drawn into cliques or gossip. This was partly her personality and partly her way of protecting herself from drama. She had already lived through enough upheaval after her husband died of a sudden heart attack 3 years ago. At the time, she had been overwhelmed with grief and fear of the future, unsure how to balance single parenthood with her demanding career. She made a promise to herself that once she and Thomas settled into a new home, she would avoid unnecessary complications. In those first months in the neighborhood, she convinced herself that a low profile was best. She waved to neighbors from across the street, offered occasional small talk about the weather, and ignored the persistent emails from the board that she saw as little more than administrative noise. But lately, she had begun to notice changes that made her uneasy. There were new security cameras mounted at the entrances of certain streets, shiny black poles with blinking red lights that no one had mentioned before. Large trucks had appeared without warning, unloading concrete barriers and heavy gates at 2 of the side streets, forcing cars to reroute. Laura assumed these were temporary safety measures or some kind of maintenance project, but the lack of communication bothered her. On one morning run, she realized that several street signs had been removed entirely, as if the board was reconfiguring the traffic flow, and there were new keypad-operated gates on a road that had previously been open. When she asked a neighbor about it, a middle-aged man she barely knew shrugged and said it was all part of upgrades to improve security, though he couldn't explain what exactly that meant. He added that the board was cracking down lately but didn't elaborate, only warning her with a tired laugh not to ignore their letters. Laura had brushed off the comment at first, but she couldn't shake the sense that the neighborhood was slowly transforming into something less friendly and more controlled. The changes were subtle, yet the effect was undeniable. Delivery drivers sometimes parked 2 blocks away, complaining that the gates wouldn't open for them. Trash pickup was delayed on certain streets because the trucks couldn't fit around the barriers. Even fire hydrants seemed harder to access, partly blocked by the new cement blocks that had been positioned at odd angles near intersections. Laura worried briefly about what would happen in a real emergency, but she pushed the thought aside because it seemed like such a remote possibility. Thomas, meanwhile, was thriving. At 15, he was quiet but bright, happiest when he was drawing designs for cars or talking to his small circle of friends from school. Laura had worked hard to make sure he felt stable and safe after the death of his father, and she could see the progress he was making. They spent evenings cooking simple dinners together and weekends catching up on movies they had both missed during the busiest years of her career. Moving to this house had been for him as much as for herself. She wanted him to have a home where he could relax, study, and grow, without the shadow of grief constantly weighing him down. She often sat on the porch at dusk with a cup of tea, listening to the hum of cicadas and watching Thomas shoot basketballs in the driveway, telling herself they had finally turned a corner. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the neighborhood lights began to flicker on, Laura noticed something strange as she drove back from the grocery store. She turned onto their street only to see a row of orange traffic cones and a temporary gate blocking the usual entrance. A security guard she didn't recognize waved her to another access point, explaining curtly that the road had been closed for improvements. Laura was startled by how abruptly the route had been changed, but did as she was told, driving an extra 5 minutes around unfamiliar side streets to reach her driveway. When she arrived home, Thomas met her at the door and asked why it had taken so long. She laughed it off, but inside she felt a growing unease. Why was there so much secrecy surrounding these projects? Why did no one on the board ever think to notify residents about something as disruptive as road closures? Later that night, after Thomas went to bed, Laura scrolled through the community email group on her laptop, searching for answers. The latest message from the board was a generic newsletter filled with vague language about enhanced neighborhood protections and temporary infrastructure upgrades, but it offered no specifics. She checked her spam folder, wondering if she had missed an important notice, but there was nothing. The lack of transparency irritated her. She had chosen this neighborhood precisely because it seemed straightforward and orderly, and now it felt like decisions were being made behind closed doors by people she barely knew. She clicked through the board's website, trying to find minutes from recent meetings, but the most recent update was dated nearly 6 months ago. Laura sat back in her chair and rubbed her temples. She told herself not to overreact. Maybe these measures were necessary, and maybe the board simply wasn't good at communicating. Still, she couldn't shake the image of those barriers partially blocking a fire hydrant or the memory of the delivery truck driver muttering about being trapped behind a closed gate. She thought about how quickly things could go wrong in an emergency if an ambulance or fire engine couldn't get through. She even considered reaching out to someone on the board just to ask for clarity, but she didn't know any of them well, and she hated the idea of coming across as confrontational. That night, she double-checked the locks on the doors and went upstairs to peek in on Thomas, who was fast asleep with his phone resting on the pillow beside him. He had no idea she was worried, and she wanted to keep it that way. Laura told herself she was being overly cautious, that the neighborhood had always been safe, and she had no real reason to believe otherwise. Yet, as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she couldn't ignore the faint hum of anxiety building in her chest. Something about the way the neighborhood was changing felt wrong, and though she couldn't quite articulate why, she knew instinctively that it wasn't the sort of problem that would resolve on its own. The emergency struck on a night that had begun so ordinarily, Laura would later replay every detail of the hours leading up to it, searching for some sign of what was coming. It was early spring, one of those evenings when the air still held the damp chill of winter, even though the days were warming. Thomas had gone to bed a little earlier than usual, tired from basketball practice, while Laura stayed downstairs finishing up revisions on a client's set of blueprints. She had just shut down her laptop when she heard a faint sound from upstairs, at first so soft she thought it might have been the wind against the windows. Then came a noise that froze her in place, a muffled, panicked, choking sound. She dropped her pen and sprinted up the stairs 2 at a time, her heart hammering before she even reached his room. Thomas was sitting upright on his bed, clutching at his throat with wide, terrified eyes. His lips were pale and he was struggling to breathe, each attempt a shallow, wheezing gasp. Laura rushed to his side and instinctively tried to calm him, but she could already see that his airway was swelling, the telltale signs of a severe allergic reaction. She had no idea what had triggered it. There had been no peanuts or other allergens in the house that evening, but she knew from the way his chest was rising and falling in shallow spasms that she didn't have much time. "Thomas, stay with me," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady as she grabbed the phone off the nightstand. She dialed 911 with trembling fingers, relaying their address to the dispatcher as clearly as she could, her eyes never leaving her son. The operator promised that an ambulance was already en route and instructed her to administer an epinephrine injector if she had one. Laura tore through the medicine cabinet in the hallway and found the EpiPen they kept for emergencies, though she had never actually had to use it before. Thomas flinched as she pressed it into his thigh, but the medication delivered with a loud click, and she prayed it would buy him enough time. She pulled him into her arms, holding him upright to keep his airway as clear as possible, whispering reassurance even as her own fear mounted with every passing second. "The ambulance is coming, sweetheart. Just hold on, they're almost here." But minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness, and the wail of approaching sirens never came. Instead, the phone in her hand buzzed with a call from an unfamiliar number. She answered immediately, and the voice on the other end belonged to a paramedic, but the tone was not what she expected. "Ma'am, we're having trouble reaching your address," he said breathlessly. "There are concrete barriers blocking the entrance to your street. The GPS is sending us in circles, and the gates we've tried are locked. Can you meet us at the nearest access point?" Laura felt her blood run cold. She remembered the newly installed gates and barriers that had appeared in recent weeks, the ones she had dismissed as a temporary nuisance. "You can't get in," she demanded, unable to keep the edge of panic from her voice. "My son can barely breathe. He doesn't have time for me to walk him halfway across the neighborhood." "We're trying to find an alternate route," the paramedic said, clearly frustrated. "But these roads are completely closed off. If you can meet us, we'll start treatment right away. Can you carry him?" Laura looked at Thomas, who was still gasping for breath despite the injection. He was tall for his age, and though she could lift him if she had to, the thought of carrying him in the dark, across unfamiliar streets and around heavy concrete blocks, was nearly impossible to fathom. "I'll try," she said, her voice breaking. She ended the call, grabbed a blanket, and wrapped it tightly around him before lifting him into her arms with a strength born of desperation. The night air was brutally cold as she stepped outside, and her bare feet stung on the porch steps before she shoved them into a pair of sneakers without socks. She hurried down the driveway, struggling under Thomas's weight, and reached the end of the street where she remembered seeing one of the new gates. Her heart sank when she saw it up close. A massive steel barrier secured with a keypad lock, the kind only accessible with a code she didn't have. She set Thomas down briefly, trying not to cry as she dialed 911 again. "The gate is locked," she told the dispatcher. "There's no way for me to open it, and my son is getting worse. You have to send someone to break through." "Ma'am, we've alerted the fire department," the dispatcher replied, "but they're encountering the same issue. Please stay on the line, and we'll direct the ambulance to the closest open access point." But Laura knew how much time they were losing. She picked Thomas up again and headed toward a side street, hoping there might be another opening. But each turn brought her to yet another barrier. She could hear her son making faint noises against her shoulder, his breaths shallow and fast, and she begged him to stay awake, promising help was on the way, even as dread clawed at her chest. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she saw flashing red lights at the far end of the street. 2 paramedics were running toward her with a stretcher, carrying their equipment because the ambulance was still stuck behind a gate. "Over here!" she screamed, and they sprinted the last 100 feet, immediately taking Thomas from her arms and starting oxygen as they checked his vitals. One of them glanced at her with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "We should have been here 10 minutes ago," he muttered as he injected another dose of epinephrine. "This is insane. These roads are completely blocked." Laura followed them back toward the ambulance, her legs shaking from exertion and fear. She watched as they stabilized Thomas as best they could in the back of the vehicle before finally forcing the gate open with a hydraulic tool so they could transport him to the hospital. She climbed inside, clutching her son's hand the entire ride, praying that the delay hadn't caused irreversible damage. At the hospital, doctors worked quickly to bring his breathing under control. They assured Laura that he would recover, but the words "barely in time" echoed in her mind like a warning bell. As she sat in the waiting room afterward, numb and exhausted, she kept thinking about how close she had come to losing him, and how the concrete barriers and locked gates had nearly cost her everything. She realized with sickening clarity that the so-called improvements in her neighborhood were not merely inconvenient, they were dangerous. And whoever had made the decision to install those obstructions had done so without considering the lives at risk. By the time Thomas was admitted for overnight observation, Laura's fear had hardened into a cold, determined anger. She knew she would never forget the sight of her son gasping for breath as precious minutes slipped away. Something in her shifted that night. She was done ignoring the decisions of the board that ran the neighborhood as if it were their private kingdom. Whatever had led to those roads being blocked needed to be exposed, because no one else should ever face what she and Thomas had endured. Laura did not sleep the night Thomas was admitted for observation at the hospital. She sat by his bed in the dimly lit pediatric ward, her eyes fixed on the slow rise and fall of his chest as he slept under the soft hum of the monitors. Every time the beeping changed rhythm, her heart jolted. She kept replaying the chaos of the night before, the barriers, the locked gates, the paramedic's frustrated voice on the phone, and each time she relived the moments, her fear curdled into something sharper. She could not believe that this was allowed to happen in a community that prided itself on being safe and orderly. By morning, after the doctor confirmed that Thomas would make a full recovery, Laura was no longer merely shaken. She was angry, and the anger gave her a kind of cold clarity. She knew she could not simply go home and pretend this was an unfortunate accident. Someone had to answer for what had nearly cost her son his life. The following day, after making sure Thomas was comfortable with a friend who had offered to stay with him for a few hours, Laura drove straight to the office of the neighborhood board, a nondescript brick building tucked behind a row of shops on the edge of the community. She had never set foot inside before and was struck by how sterile it felt. A narrow lobby with beige walls, a receptionist desk guarded by a glass partition, and a locked door leading deeper into the building. There were no names posted on the wall, no photographs of the board members, nothing welcoming about the place. She approached the partition and explained why she was there, her voice even but firm. But the receptionist, a middle-aged woman with an impassive expression, cut her off before she could finish. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked flatly, as if Laura were trying to see a doctor rather than address a life-threatening issue. "No," Laura replied, feeling her frustration rise. "But I'm a resident, and my son nearly died because emergency services couldn't get past your barriers. I need to speak to someone now." The receptionist barely blinked. "I'm afraid the board does not allow walk-ins. If you'd like to submit a formal request, I can give you the appropriate form, and someone will contact you when they're available." Laura stared at her in disbelief. "You expect me to fill out paperwork and wait for a call? My son could have died because of what you've done. I'm not leaving until someone explains why those gates were locked." At that moment, the glass door clicked open, and a tall woman in a tailored suit stepped into the lobby. Laura recognized her from a distance. This was Catherine Boyd, the president of the board, a figure she had only ever seen at a glance during the occasional community event. Catherine's presence was commanding in a way that made people instinctively lower their voices, but Laura refused to be intimidated. Catherine crossed the room with a practiced smile that did not reach her eyes and gestured toward a small conference room off the lobby. "Ms. Martin, is it? Let's discuss this privately," she said smoothly. The room Catherine led her into was sparse. Just a table, 4 chairs, and a stack of documents neatly arranged at one end. Laura sat down, her palms pressed flat against the cool surface to keep herself steady, while Catherine remained standing, hands clasped in front of her. "I understand you're upset about the recent incident," Catherine began in a tone that was almost condescendingly calm. "But I assure you, the barriers and gates are part of a security initiative designed to protect everyone. We have had several issues with crime spilling over from outside the community, and the board decided these measures were necessary." Laura leaned forward, incredulous. "Security initiative? Do you understand that those barriers prevented an ambulance from reaching my son when he was in anaphylactic shock? He could have died. How can you justify that?" Catherine tilted her head slightly as though Laura were overreacting. "I'm sorry for your experience, but all residents were notified in advance and emergency services were given the codes to the gates. If there was a delay, it must have been a miscommunication with the paramedics. These procedures have been in place for weeks without incident." "That's not true," Laura shot back. "I never received any notification. And if emergency services had the codes, why couldn't they get in? Why were they running down the street with a stretcher instead of driving up to my house?" For the first time, Catherine's composed facade cracked ever so slightly. She shifted her weight and glanced at the closed door before replying. "Look, Miss Martin, I'm not here to debate. The board's decisions are final, and they're in the best interest of the community. If you're unhappy, you're welcome to file a formal complaint, but I would advise against making accusations you can't substantiate. It won't help your case." Laura felt a surge of anger so strong she almost stood up, but she forced herself to remain seated. She reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and pressed the record button before setting it face down on the table. "I'm not making accusations," she said evenly. "I'm telling you that your barriers put lives at risk. I want the codes to the gates, and I want confirmation that emergency services can access every street in this neighborhood immediately. If I don't get that, I will be going to the city and to the press." Catherine's eyes narrowed slightly. "This isn't the way to handle things, Ms. Martin," she said, her voice low. "We all have to live here together, and the board has the authority to enforce community standards. I'd hate for you to find yourself in violation of those standards because of a misunderstanding." It was a thinly veiled threat, and Laura recognized it for what it was. She stood slowly, her hands trembling with controlled fury. "I'm not afraid of your standards," she said. "What I am afraid of is another resident dying because you decided to lock down the neighborhood like a private fortress. If you won't take responsibility, I will make sure someone else does." She left the building without another word, her phone still recording in her pocket. The exchange had confirmed what she already suspected. The board was not going to fix this on its own. Catherine's dismissive attitude, the complete lack of transparency, the thinly veiled threats, they all pointed to a leadership that cared more about control than about safety. On her way back to her car, Laura passed one of the newer gates and paused to study it more closely. The keypad was industrial grade, clearly designed to withstand tampering, and there was no indication of who had installed it. She noticed a small metal plate at the base with the name of a contractor she didn't recognize. Redwell Community Solutions. The name lodged in her mind, though she had never heard of the company before. She took a picture of the plate with her phone, thinking it might be a lead to follow up on later. Back at home, Thomas was resting, and Laura didn't want to burden him with the details of her confrontation, but she couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that the barriers were just the beginning. Later that afternoon, she went for a walk around the neighborhood, ostensibly to clear her head, but really to see what else she could learn. She discovered that at least 3 streets were now completely blocked by barriers and that the newly installed gates were scattered across the community in ways that made emergency access almost impossible without intimate knowledge of the layout. A delivery driver she passed muttered under his breath about how "this place is a nightmare now," and Laura felt a pang of sympathy. When she returned home, she found an envelope wedged in her mailbox with the board's letterhead. Inside was a notice citing her for disruptive conduct at the office and warning that any further aggressive behavior could result in fines. Laura sat at her kitchen table reading the letter, her hands shaking with disbelief. Instead of acknowledging their role in endangering lives, the board was doubling down and trying to intimidate her into silence. She knew then that she couldn't fight this alone. She opened her laptop and began drafting an email to the city's fire department and emergency services division, explaining in detail what had happened to Thomas and how the barriers had delayed the ambulance. She attached photos of the gates and a copy of the letter she had received, making sure to document everything carefully. She didn't know yet what the next step would be, but she was done hoping the board would come to its senses on its own. As she pressed send on the email, A knock came at the door. She froze for a moment, then opened it to find Karen from across the street standing there, her arms folded tightly. Karen's expression was pinched with the same frustration Laura had been feeling all day. "I heard what happened," she said quietly. "You're not the only one who's had a problem with those gates. They're out of control, and someone's going to get killed if we don't stop them. If you're going after the board, I want in." Laura hesitated only a moment before nodding. She didn't fully trust Karen yet. She had a reputation for being volatile, but she sensed that having another resident willing to speak up could make a difference. "Then we do this together," Laura said. For the first time since the ordeal began, she felt a flicker of hope. Laura woke up the next morning with the same restless energy that had kept her awake most of the night. She had spent hours replaying the conversation with Catherine Boyd in her head, the calm, almost mocking tone the board president had used, the dismissive way she had minimized what happened to Thomas, and the veiled threat about violations. Laura knew the letter she received afterward was part of that same intimidation tactic, an attempt to make her doubt herself and retreat. But instead of backing down, it only made her more determined to act. The email she had sent to the fire department and emergency services division had already been acknowledged with an automatic reply, and she decided to follow up by phone to ensure someone actually read it. The man who answered at the fire department sounded skeptical at first, but when Laura calmly described the incident and explained that emergency vehicles had been unable to access entire streets due to the barriers, his tone shifted. He admitted that the department had received similar complaints from delivery services and even utility companies, but said they had not been aware that the issue was affecting emergency response times. He asked her to email the photographs she had taken again and to provide the exact locations of the gates, which Laura did immediately. For the first time since the ordeal began, she felt like someone in an official position was listening. Karen came over later that morning, holding a thick folder of papers she had been saving. She was visibly agitated, pacing Laura's kitchen as she explained that she had been cited by the board multiple times over the last year for what she called ridiculous infractions, like leaving her trash cans out an extra hour or having a flower bed, that didn't match aesthetic guidelines. She believed the board was abusing its authority and had started keeping records of every notice, every fine, and every communication she received from them. The file she handed to Laura was thick with letters and copies of checks she had been forced to write. "They're bullies," Karen said bitterly. "They think they can do whatever they want because nobody ever pushes back. But this time, we have proof." Laura looked through the folder and was stunned by the volume of documentation. Many of the letters carried the same cold, bureaucratic language as the one she had received after her confrontation with Catherine. She realized that Karen's experience was not unique, but part of a larger pattern. The board used its power to pressure residents into compliance, and anyone who questioned their decisions was punished. Karen pointed to one particular letter that ordered her to attend a disciplinary hearing for an alleged violation that had never been explained. She had refused to go, and the fines had doubled. "They want you to feel like you're trapped," Karen said. "But if enough of us go to the city with this, they won't be able to ignore it." That afternoon, Laura compiled everything: her email chain with the fire department, the photos of the gates and barriers, Karen's documentation, and the notice the board had sent her, and took it all to City Hall. She requested a meeting with someone in the public safety department and was eventually shown into a small office where a middle-aged man named Charles Owens, a deputy director, listened as she described in detail what had happened. Laura's voice was steady as she laid out the facts, but she could feel her pulse racing with each sentence. Charles frowned as he reviewed the photographs, especially the ones showing barriers placed directly in front of fire hydrants. "These installations were never approved by our office," he said gravely. "In fact, I'm not aware of any city permits for this kind of work in your neighborhood." He asked Laura for the name of the contractor, and when she mentioned Redwell Community Solutions, Charles looked up sharply. He said he had never heard of the company and promised to investigate whether it was properly licensed. He explained that unauthorized barriers could result in significant fines and even criminal charges if they endangered public safety. Laura left the office with a promise that the city would be conducting an inspection within days, but she knew better than to assume the board would sit quietly and wait for the results. Her instincts were confirmed almost immediately. That evening, Laura found another envelope taped to her front door. This one accused her of defaming the board and warned that her continued disruption could result in legal action. She read the letter twice, her hands trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief. It was clear the board knew she was escalating the issue, and they were trying to scare her into silence. She considered calling Catherine directly, but she doubted it would accomplish anything except give the woman another chance to intimidate her. Instead, she called Karen, who came over within minutes. Together, they decided the best course of action was to bring in legal help. Laura reached out to a local attorney named David Clark, recommended by a friend who specialized in property disputes and community association law. David agreed to meet them the next morning and told Laura to bring every piece of documentation she had. He also advised her not to respond to any more letters from the board until they had a chance to review the situation together. As Laura hung up the phone, she felt a flicker of relief that someone with experience was about to step in, but she also knew the fight was far from over. She looked out the front window and noticed a car idling slowly past her house before turning the corner. It might have been nothing, but in that moment, it felt like eyes were on her. Karen muttered that she had seen the same car parked near her own house earlier that week, and the two women exchanged a glance that said neither of them believed it was a coincidence. By the time Laura went to bed that night, she knew she had crossed a line the board would not forgive. But she also knew there was no turning back. Too much was at stake now, not just for Thomas but for every resident who lived behind those gates. The inspection promised by the city and the involvement of an attorney gave her hope, but she braced herself for retaliation. The board had built a system of control over the community for years, and Laura had no illusions that they would surrender it without a fight. Laura and Karen arrived at David Clark's office the next morning with an uneasy sense of purpose. They had spent the previous night gathering every scrap of documentation they could find, stacking it neatly into folders and labeling each section with sticky notes. The attorney's office was in a modest brick building downtown, and David himself struck Laura as the kind of man who knew how to navigate complicated situations without flinching. He was in his late 40s, with a quiet confidence and a direct way of speaking that immediately put both women at ease. After listening patiently as they recounted the events of the past week, he began reviewing the documents they had brought. His brow furrowed as he read through the letters from the board and examined the photographs of the gates. "This is serious," David said finally, looking up from the pile of papers. "The barriers alone are a major liability, but the way they've been retaliating against you is just as troubling. Threatening fines, making veiled legal threats, labeling you as disruptive. This is classic intimidation. They're trying to scare you into backing down, and they're doing it in writing, which will not work in their favor." Karen leaned forward, her voice sharp. "We're not backing down. My car tires were slashed 2 nights ago, and I'm sure it's connected. I've had enough of living in fear of them." David nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'm going to file for an emergency injunction to have the barriers temporarily removed while the city investigates. We'll use your son's medical emergency and the letters as evidence that the board is putting lives at risk. But I need you both to understand that this isn't going to be quick or easy. They'll fight back hard because they know what's at stake." Laura felt a tight knot form in her stomach. What exactly is at stake for them? David tapped the stack of letters with one finger. Control. Money. Those gates didn't install themselves, and a company like this Redwell Community Solutions doesn't just appear out of nowhere. Someone is profiting, and if we start pulling at the threads, they're going to get desperate. Laura left the meeting feeling both relieved and uneasy. It was comforting to have someone like David on their side, but she understood the warning in his voice. That afternoon, she tried to distract herself by catching up on work, but her concentration kept shattering every time she glanced at the clock or heard a noise outside. Karen called twice to report that the same unfamiliar car they had noticed earlier was once again parked at the corner near her house, the driver sitting inside for long stretches of time. When Laura checked her own street, she saw nothing, but the idea that someone might be watching made her skin crawl. 2 days later, the city sent inspectors into the neighborhood. Laura saw their trucks arrive in the morning, orange vests flashing in the sunlight as they walked from barrier to barrier, taking photographs and making notes. Several residents watched from their porches, whispering to each other, but no one approached the inspectors. Laura wanted to talk to them but forced herself to stay inside, remembering David's advice not to interfere. Hours later, she saw the trucks leave, and for a brief moment, she thought the barriers might actually come down. But that night, a notice was slipped under her door. It was from the board, claiming that the inspectors had found no violations and accusing Laura and Karen of inciting panic and hostility in the community. The letter ended with a warning that continued defamation and harassment could result in legal action. Laura stared at the notice for a long time, her hands shaking. She knew it was a lie. There was no way the city would clear such blatant obstructions. But the letter was clearly meant to demoralize her and make her doubt the process. She called David immediately, and he told her to ignore the letter. "They're bluffing," he said. "The city has already confirmed to me that they found multiple violations. We're filing the injunction tomorrow. In the meantime, be careful. If they sense they're losing control, they might escalate." David's warning proved prophetic. The following afternoon, Laura returned home from the grocery store to find a police cruiser parked in front of her house. 2 officers were waiting on the porch, and one of them stepped forward as she approached. "Ms. Martin," he asked, glancing at a clipboard, "we've received a complaint from the community board about unpermitted construction on your property. They're alleging that you've been altering the exterior without approval." Laura's jaw dropped. "That's ridiculous. I haven't done any construction." The officer nodded as if he already knew. "We figured as much, but we're required to respond when a complaint is filed. Do you mind if we take a quick look around?" Laura agreed, and after a cursory inspection, the officers confirmed that there was nothing out of place. But the experience left her shaken. It was a clear attempt by the board to use law enforcement as a tool of intimidation. When she told David about it later, he sighed. "They're trying to build a narrative that you're the problem, that you're disruptive and non-compliant. Don't let it rattle you. It's a tactic." By the end of the week, the pressure intensified. Karen's mailbox was ripped out of the ground one night and someone spray-painted "Troublemaker" across the side of her garage. Another neighbor, an elderly man named Bill who had quietly supported Laura and Karen, received a letter threatening to revoke his amenities privileges if he associated with residents who undermined community standards. Bill was so frightened that he stopped answering his door. Laura realized with a sinking feeling that the board's strategy was working. Other residents were becoming too afraid to even be seen with her. Then came the night that convinced Laura this fight was no longer just about legalities. Around 11 p.m., she was sitting at the kitchen table reviewing documents for David when a loud bang rattled the windows. She jumped up and ran to the front door, flinging it open just in time to see the taillights of a car disappearing down the street. Her heart pounded as she stepped onto the porch and looked down. Someone had thrown a rock through her living room window, shattering the glass and scattering shards across the floor. She called the police, but by the time they arrived, the car was long gone. One of the officers took her statement and shook his head. "We're seeing more of this lately," he said. "People taking disputes into their own hands. Do you have any idea who might want to scare you?" Laura didn't answer immediately. She knew the officers couldn't do anything without evidence, and she doubted they would risk challenging the board even if she told them. When they left, she called David, who urged her to stay with a friend for the night. But Laura refused. She wasn't going to let whoever was behind this drive her from her home. Instead, she double-checked the locks, swept up the broken glass, and sat awake until dawn with a baseball bat across her lap, listening to every creak of the house. The next day, David called with news. The judge had granted their request for a hearing on the injunction, scheduled for the following week. He warned Laura to expect more retaliation as the date approached. They know the city's findings are damning, and they're going to try to paint you as unstable or vindictive. Keep documenting everything, and don't let them bait you into reacting. That advice was easier said than done. The board's campaign of pressure seemed endless. Anonymous notes appeared in Laura's mailbox telling her to stop making trouble and to think about your son's future. Karen received a fake citation claiming she owed thousands of dollars in back dues, and when she called the number listed on the notice, the voice on the other end threatened to place a lien on her house. One afternoon, Laura returned home to find a man in a Redwell Community Solutions jacket standing at the gate near her street. When she asked what he was doing, he smiled tightly and said, "Just routine maintenance, ma'am." She could tell by the way he avoided her eyes that he was lying. As the hearing drew closer, Laura felt the weight of the fight pressing down on her. She tried to shield Thomas from the worst of it, but he could sense her tension. One night, he asked quietly, "Mom, are we going to have to move?" Laura knelt in front of him and promised they wouldn't, even though a small voice in the back of her mind wondered if staying was worth the cost. But she also knew that if she gave up now, the board would only become bolder. On the morning of the hearing, Laura stood outside the courthouse with David and Karen, clutching a folder of evidence so thick it felt like it could break her arms. She had no idea what the outcome would be, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was no longer afraid of the board's threats. They had pushed her too far, and now they would have to answer for what they had done. The courthouse hallway felt suffocatingly warm as Laura waited outside the courtroom, her hands clasped tightly around the thick folder of evidence she had brought. David stood next to her, calm and steady as always, quietly reviewing his notes one last time while Karen shifted restlessly at her side. Across the hall, Catherine Boyd and several other board members were gathered in a neat cluster, whispering among themselves with the same smug, self-assured expressions Laura had seen at every community meeting she had attended. They looked like people who believed they were untouchable, and that belief only made Laura more determined to see the truth laid bare. She felt the weight of every sleepless night, every threatening letter, every fear-filled moment in her own home pressing on her shoulders, and she knew that whatever happened in the next few hours would determine not just her future, but the safety of everyone in the neighborhood. When the judge entered the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Everyone rose and then sat again, the air thick with tension. David began by calmly outlining the sequence of events: the unauthorized installation of barriers and gates, the obstruction of emergency services, and the retaliation Laura and Karen had endured for speaking up. He spoke with precision, never raising his voice, but each word landed with weight as he described how Thomas had nearly died because an ambulance could not reach their home in time. Laura could feel the eyes of the courtroom on her as David gestured toward her and recounted the night of the allergic reaction, and she kept her gaze fixed on the judge, refusing to look at Catherine or the others. Catherine's attorney responded with a practiced performance, insisting that the board had acted in the best interests of the community and that the barriers were part of a legitimate security initiative. He tried to frame Laura as a troublemaker who was exaggerating for dramatic effect, pointing to the notices she had received as evidence that she was combative and non-compliant. Laura felt her stomach twist with anger, but she remembered David's warning and kept her expression neutral. Then David produced the email chain from the city's fire department confirming that no permits had been issued for the barriers. He presented photographs showing gates placed directly in front of fire hydrants, and he held up the letters Laura and Karen had received threatening fines and legal action. The judge studied each document carefully, his expression hardening as David spoke. "Your Honor," David said finally, "this is not about one resident's inconvenience. This is about a governing body that placed control and profit above the lives of the very people they were supposed to serve. If my client's son had died that night, we would not be here for an injunction. We would be here for a wrongful death trial. Catherine shifted uncomfortably in her seat as the judge turned his attention to the board's attorney. "What is this Redwell Community Solutions?" the judge asked sharply. "I see their name on these installations, yet there is no record of them being a licensed contractor with the city." The attorney faltered. "Your Honor, I'm not sure of the specifics. That was handled internally by the board's Facilities Committee." The judge's voice grew colder. "Handled internally? You authorized unlicensed work that directly obstructed emergency services. I suggest you get very sure of the specifics, because what I see here is not only negligence but a blatant disregard for public safety." At that moment, the doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and a man Laura recognized stepped inside. Michael. Jennings, the former board member who had abruptly resigned weeks earlier. He walked straight to the witness stand without making eye contact with anyone, his shoulders hunched as if bracing for impact. David had told Laura that Michael might cooperate, but she hadn't dared to hope. Michael's testimony shattered the last of the board's defenses. He admitted that Redwell Community Solutions was a shell company he had helped set up at Catherine's direction. The board had funneled community funds into Redwell under the guise of security upgrades, inflating invoices and pocketing the difference. Catherine and 2 other board members had personally profited from the arrangement, and the barriers had been installed quickly and quietly to justify the expense. "I wanted out," Michael said quietly, his voice barely audible in the silent courtroom. "I didn't sign up for people getting hurt. When I heard about the ambulance, I knew it had gone too far." Catherine erupted, rising from her chair and shouting that Michael was lying, that he was a disgruntled former member trying to save himself. But the judge silenced her with a single sharp command and ordered her to sit down. He turned to the bailiff and instructed that the testimony and evidence be forwarded immediately to the district attorney's office for a criminal investigation. When the judge finally delivered his ruling, his words were clear and unequivocal. The barriers and gates were to be removed within 48 hours at the board's expense. The board was suspended from all governance activities pending the outcome of the investigation, and an independent administrator would be appointed to manage the community in the interim. The court finds that the defendant's actions constituted gross negligence and reckless endangerment, the judge concluded. Lives were placed at risk for the sake of financial gain, and that is something this court will not tolerate. Laura felt a wave of emotion crash over her, a mixture of relief and exhaustion so intense it left her trembling. Catherine sat stone-faced at the defense table, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking as the reality of the situation settled around her. The other board members avoided Laura's gaze as they shuffled out of the courtroom, now facing not just the loss of their positions but the possibility of criminal charges. David placed a reassuring hand on Laura's shoulder. "You did it," he said quietly. "They're finished." But Laura knew it wasn't just about the board. It was about Thomas, about every resident who had been silenced or intimidated, about the principle that no one should have the power to endanger lives in the name of control. As she walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sunlight, Karen beside her and Michael lingering behind with his own uncertain future, Laura felt a sense of vindication she had not thought possible. The fight was not entirely over. The criminal investigation would take time, but the community was free from the stranglehold of those who had abused their authority. And for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to breathe without fear. The days following the judge's ruling felt almost surreal for Laura. For the first time in months, she woke each morning without the gnawing dread of what new letter might be waiting in her mailbox, or whether another rock would come crashing through her window. The barriers and gates that had once made her neighborhood feel like a maze of control were dismantled piece by city crews, their trucks lining the streets as they worked in the spring sun. Neighbors emerged from their homes to watch, many of them exchanging cautious nods and murmurs of relief. Laura saw people she barely knew stopping to talk with one another for the first time in weeks, a sign that the fear that had kept everyone isolated was finally beginning to lift. Thomas returned to his normal routine, his energy restored, though Laura could tell the experience had left its mark on him. He was more watchful now, more likely to ask where she was going and when she would be back, and Laura reassured him with gentle honesty rather than empty promises. "It's over," she told him one night as they stood on the porch watching the last of the trucks haul away the concrete blocks. "They can't hurt us anymore." He nodded, but stayed close to her side, and she knew that trust would take time to rebuild. Karen, too, was adjusting to the new reality. She had become something of a reluctant symbol in the neighborhood, other residents stopping her in the street to thank her for speaking out alongside Laura. Some admitted they had wanted to support them earlier, but had been too afraid of retaliation. Karen accepted the gratitude with a shrug, though Laura could see the pride flickering beneath her guarded expression. The vandalism on Karen's garage had been scrubbed away, and she had already started repainting the door, a bold color she said was definitely not on their stupid guidelines list. The city's appointment of an independent administrator to oversee the neighborhood brought further changes. A quiet, competent woman named Ellen Pierce began holding open forums at the community center where residents could voice concerns without fear of retribution. She listened carefully, took notes, and outlined a plan to review every policy and financial record the board had implemented. Ellen explained that the investigation into the former board's actions was ongoing and that criminal charges were likely, given the evidence of embezzlement and endangerment uncovered in court. Catherine Boyd and the others had all retained criminal defense attorneys, but their influence over the neighborhood had evaporated overnight. Laura attended one of the forums but chose to sit near the back, listening rather than speaking. She had no desire to become a fixture in the community's new governance or to hold any official role. She simply wanted to live her life without the constant weight of conflict. When Ellen asked if she would consider joining the interim advisory group, Laura declined politely. "I think my part is done," she said later to David when he called to congratulate her again. "This was never about power. It was about making sure no one else went through what we did." In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted. Children played outside again, their laughter carrying down the now open streets. Delivery drivers returned to familiar routes without the frustration of locked gates. Even the elderly residents, who had once been confined by the barriers, could be seen walking to visit friends without worrying about being trapped on the wrong side of a fence. Laura noticed the change in herself as well. The constant vigilance that had become second nature slowly faded, replaced by a cautious optimism she hadn't felt in a long time. One afternoon, Laura received a letter from the district attorney's office informing her that she and Thomas might be called as witnesses in the criminal case against Catherine and the others. The prospect was daunting, but Laura knew she would do it if asked. She placed the letter in the same folder that held all the documentation she had meticulously gathered, a reminder of how far they had come. That evening, she and Thomas sat on the back porch eating dinner together, the air filled with the scent of blooming flowers and freshly cut grass. It was a simple moment, but Laura felt its significance deeply. Karen stopped by before sunset with a plate of homemade cookies, laughing as she handed them over. "Don't get used to this," she said with mock sternness. "I'm not turning into the neighborhood baker." Laura smiled, grateful for the friendship that had grown out of shared adversity. As they sat together talking, they could hear the faint hum of traffic on the main road beyond the neighborhood, a sound that had once been muffled by barriers and gates but now felt like proof of freedom. Laura understood that the scars of what had happened would not vanish overnight. There would be more hearings, more questions from prosecutors, and more reminders of the danger Thomas had been in. But she also knew that their lives no longer revolved around fear. They had faced down people who believed they were beyond accountability and had proven otherwise. That knowledge gave Laura